Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What an honor it is today to welcome Grant Wacker as our guest on Conversing. Dr. Grant Wacker is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Christian History at Duke Divinity School, a place where he's served for many, many years. He's a remarkable person who has been part of the Duke faculty for many years following his time at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He specializes in American Christian history, and he's the author or co-author of 9 books, including Heaven Below, Early Pentecostals and American Culture, America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation, One Soul at a Time, The Story of Billy Graham, and more than 200 additional articles, essays, and other books. He is a person who I've known for many years, in part through our co-association with Fuller Theological Seminary, he on the board, and I during my time of service at Fuller. He's an inspiration and an encouragement to me. He's a man who carries his faith and his scholarship together in a vigorous and thoughtful and often humorous way. Dr. Grant Wacker, I could not be happier that you're here as our guest on Conversing today.
Thank you, Mark. It is an honor to be here.
Well, I have delighted in knowing you over many years now, and the wonderment that you bring to so many things through your insight. But particularly today, I want to focus on your insight related to being a historian. You've been a very significant American historian, American church historian in particular, and you have been in the same league as people like Mark Knoll and other people who I know we both greatly honor. But your voice is a very distinct voice, and the work that you've done over the years is what I am eager for our listeners to know more about, if they already know you, or to become acquainted with, if you're a new name to them. So let's start really with just a little bit of personal background. Give us a few minutes of description about what formed you as you were growing up, where you were born, how did it happen that you landed as a historian of all the possible things that you might have done.
All right. Well, I'll give that a shot. Grew up in Springfield, Missouri, which in those days was a small town. It seemed like in the backwoods of the Ozarks. And the joke was that we were so far back in the woods, even the Episcopalians handled snakes. So that may have been a bit of an exaggeration, but anyway, it was a small town and headquarters of the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal denomination. And my father was a Assemblies of God pastor. My grandfather was also, my grandfather was the general superintendent of the Assemblies of God. So I grew up right in the heart of the denomination and went to college in California, and that was an awakening experience in itself. And then to graduate school in New England. And then my first job was at University of North Carolina. And after 15 years, I started looking for a better basketball team and looked across the highway. For those who don't know the geography, Duke is 8 miles away across a major highway from UNC. And so I went to Duke and taught the divinity school, and I loved it. It was a wonderful experience.
That's great. That's great. Now, why history? How did that part unfold?
Actually, that was the result of a teacher. I went to divinity school, went to Harvard Divinity School with the illusion that I was going to be a philosopher and make a lot of money. I wanted to make big money, so major in philosophy and preferably metaphysics. And so I went to Harvard Divinity School and took a course in philosophy, but then I took a required course in American Christian history from a wonderful mentor, now gone, named Bill Hutchison. The man was legendary. He had trained a lot of people, and I just fell under the sway of his teaching.
Right, right. History is always important at any given moment, but surely we live in a period right now when history and history, as we think about it through the lens of Christian faith, is up for debate and is constantly being battered in various directions. And it makes it all the more important that we study history and know and try to grasp history. One of the things that's often happened in American history over all of its history, I believe, has been people who have tried to interpret American history through the lens of God's activity and through, in particular, the ways that people have believed that God has perhaps specially, but in any case, particularly acted or moved or spoken into American history. Because you're at the noble age of 80 and are a person who has a big
and one
vision.
half, 80 and a half. So it's
80
even
and
more
a half.
noble.
I forgot about the other 6 months. Yeah, sorry about that. History again. It brings us back to reality. So, yes. So because you are in this moment of your life, I'd love to have you give us your take on how you believe or see God having acted or spoken or worked in some particular way in America.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I mean, that's a predictably astute question coming from you. And yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It is a controversial question, to put that mildly, because the churches want to say something and they think that they have a particular province, and that's understandable. I think they do. And then there's the Secular History Guild, which is very touchy about any kind of infringement, as they see it, from people with an apologetic or confessional interest. And then in addition to that, we have a lot of identity politics today that also makes its claim upon history. And so history, as I think, is probably not uniquely, but it's certainly a especially controverted area of discussion with a lot of people claiming special rights of how to do it. So, yeah, I have thought about the question of theology and history, and I had to because I taught in a divinity school. But more than that, or in addition to that, I was privileged to direct doctoral students who are not in the divinity school. And so they have a separate agenda, a separate epistemology, separate way of understanding history.
Right.
And the people in the divinity school have theirs. And I don't think that they are, sometimes they are mutually exclusive depending upon the project, but in general, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. There are ways that they can enrich one another. And so it's an important question to ask. Can we see God's hand in history? But also, I think we can break that down into more manageable components and say, can we see religion operating in history? Mm-hmm. And then there's a separate component, can we see the divine hand?
Yes. Those are different things.
And I believe it's quite manageable. Many of the very finest religious historians are not believers. Historically, some of the best have not been and still are not. And they do superb work in understanding where religion lies. Whether you want to go further and see God's hand, well, then you have a more difficult task, because then it involves certain kinds of claims which are very difficult to adjudicate within history, secular history.
Are there places, I don't know what we might say, like 11 places you see God at work in American history? Do you want to give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, 11 places. And I should stress that it's exactly 11.
I see.
They're not 10, they're not 12, it's not 11 and a half. I mean, it's precise. Now, there was a time in my life when I thought there were 13, but now we have obviously I'm teasing about this, and it is an open question as to what areas or what dimensions we can see. Well, we certainly can see the power of religion in 11 areas, but whether and how we see a divine hand is a different and more difficult matter. All right, let me put a wider context, and I think that no matter what events or series of events we find, we have to remember that there is an embracing context. And every historian will have a different way of articulating this, but my own sense is that when you're speaking about the American story, there are 4 major contexts to think about. And the first is one we don't talk about, and that's just the physical context. This is a unique land in terms of the amount of coastlines, the rivers, the Mississippi River, the arable land, and what that means ultimately is that we are a people of plenty. We are particularly prosperous, partly because of the accident of just the physical geography that we've inherited. Okay. A second feature is, I'll use the broad term, capitalism. And by that, I mean, use that as an umbrella term to refer to the premium put upon individual effort, the attempt to harness time and energy for both individual change, social change. It's a term I'm using loosely to suggest a powerful impulse throughout the history. All right. A third one is immigration. And I mean immigration broadly, that we're all immigrants, going back to the Native Americans. They were at one point 50,000 years ago, so they were immigrants. And we're all immigrants. But the very process of immigration is one thing that affects all of us. But more than that, especially from the 19th century forward, with immigration, we see the confluence of many languages and ethnicities abutting. Okay. And then the fourth is racism, racial pride, and particularly by the dominant white culture and the malign effects that racism has affected, particularly upon the attempt to displace and often exterminate the Native Americans and then enslave the peoples from Africa. So those are 4: physical, capitalist, immigration, and race. All right. Now, within that broader framework, here's my suggestion of places where I think we can certainly see the power of religious impulses, and then people with a theological inclination, as I hope I have, may see the divine hand at least shaping and nudging history. And the first would be colonization and the whole process that brought people to the New World. I use colonization broadly, going all the way back to the natives, of course, but also the involuntary colonization by the enslavement of Africans, plus immigration, but the whole expansionist impulse that we see throughout American history, that's just embedded in our DNA. All right. The second would be the subjection of native populations that whites encountered. And subjection's a mild term. Very often it was an attempt to, at the very least, displace or exterminate. The third would be enslavement. And that starts almost at the beginning. There's some controversy as to how early, whether it's in 1619 or a few decades after that it is solidified in law, but very early in the whole process, we see involuntary enslavement. And then I would go to a fourth one, and that is Enlightenment. This is the process by which settlers brought ideas inherited from Europe almost entirely, but it's ideas that would relegate God to a separate realm. It distanced God from human affairs. And Today we think we're not, many of us think we're not affected by the Enlightenment. But a wonderful historian at Cornell many years ago said, we are so much children of the Enlightenment, we don't even know it when we are using enlightened categories.
Right.
All right. All right. So that's number 4. Fifth one would be republicanism with a small r. And there, the whole process of trying to create a society in which ordinary people had a say in the government that controlled their lives. 6 would be all of America's wars, and especially the Civil War and World War II. This is a matter of debate. I mean, other wars you could see, as some people would say, are all wars of choice, but the Civil War, World War II seem not to have been, and these have a particularly powerful, theological components, as well as certainly religion is certainly operative there. 7, a reformist thread. Throughout all of American history, people are constantly seeking to reform. And I don't know a whole lot about other countries' histories, to say the least, but I have a sense that the American story is distinctive. It's not unique, but it's certainly distinctive in the extent to which there's this constant effort to make life better. There's not, what we do not find is a sense of resignation that, well, that's just the way it is and it's just going to be that way. Yeah, some people. But the society as a whole is constantly got its mind to how things can be better. And that's both liberal and conservative. We find that everywhere on the map. Conservatives, as much as liberals or vice versa, say, oh, we can change things. Okay. Then I would go on to get right to your world, Mark, your Presbyterian world, and that is Reformed theology. And Reformed theology has its technical parts, and I don't mean that Americans in general are terribly worried about supralapsarianism. I am. I spend many of my nights just anguished deep into the night about supra versus infralaps. All right, teasing again. All right. But by Reformed theology, I mean the theology that, well, the Puritans brought with them, many other people brought with them. But again, it's the thrust behind Reformed theology. And that thrust is the sense that the American experiment is special. It is a product of providential guidance. Now, we can secularize that and say, well, it's just manifest destiny, or there are other forces that just make Americans want to be militaristic or expansionist. But I think that you can make a strong case that behind this is this reformed notion of providential guidance of society. And I would say something more to it, though, and that is not all of us, unfortunately, not all of us, but are the best representatives of the Reformed theology are those who are impressed by the necessity of humility in the face of God's guidance of history. We don't run our lives. We don't run our show. Something else is running the show. Now, I'm not saying that's all that widespread, but at its very heart, this is what Reformed theology means for me. The 9th would be, in a sense, the opposite. Wesleyan theology. I happen to be a Methodist, and you knew this was coming. And, the old joke is Methodism is what happens when Reformed theology hits reality. You're going to have to think about that. Maybe you won't have to think about that. All right. But Wesleyan theology emphasizes another set of variables, and that is human ability. Technically, for the Wesleyans, is that humans have the ability to reach out and take the gift of grace. And John Wesley called that prevenient grace. Okay, we are naturally equipped to have that ability just to reach out and to take it and internalize it. Well, that's a theological way of putting it. I think the larger emphasis, though, is that Wesleyan theology stresses human enablement and responsibility. There's two sides of that.
Yes.
If we're able to do it, we are responsible for doing it.
Yes.
All right? Then the 10th would be Roman Catholic theology. And that's a part of American history that has not been sufficiently attended to until maybe the last 30 years. But some magnificent historians working at Notre Dame and other Catholic universities and elsewhere have helped to recover the beauty of Catholic theology, and particularly its attention to history. We are the product of 2,000 years of Christian history. We, meaning the Christian parts of the civilization. There's 2 millennia of history behind us. And we have the Catholic sensibility to thank for that, as well as the wonderful awareness of the power of liturgy to bring us to faith and to keep us in faith. If I could be personal about this, just a couple of days ago, I was attended the confirmation of my grandson in a Roman Catholic, large Roman Catholic church, actually a Roman Catholic megachurch in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was just overwhelmed by the beauty of the service and the sense of reverence. Also, I was overwhelmed by the sense that at least half of a significant number of the people were Latina, and much of the service was in Spanish. And again, so the Catholic story reminds us of the rainbow of God's creation. 11 renewal movements. Everywhere, always, constantly. We just see these renewal movements wherever we look in our history. They don't always come across as renewal movements, but you look at them just a little bit, and Americans are just constantly seeking to make things better. Now, if I were allowed 13, I would bring in here the power of music and the power of the aesthetic part of our religious heritage, church architecture and the like. But since I'm only allowed 11, I'll just have to, since I don't know anything about those latter 2, I'm going to leave it at 11. Okay.
Thank you. That's quite a fascinating list. I want to just go back to a couple and ask a little bit more about how you were saying these things. So you mentioned in the first group of 4, racism as one of those elements, and then later enslavement. Now, I think what you're saying in each of these cases is that these are not signs of God's activity, but signs of religion's activity, which is in part done in the name of God. Both
exactly.
Some religious instincts and enslavement.
Yes, yeah.
And in that way, just, slavery has been obviously called America's original sin. Just comment a bit more about that, because it is one of those things that is in that list that you've given, so many of which have both positive and negative implications, of course. All of those items play in different ways in different people's minds and experience. But I would just wonder if you, especially having spent so much of your life in the southern U.S., how do you understand the theological presence and absence of God in this most wounding sin?
Oh, Mark, that's such a memorable and a way of putting it, wounding sin, a permanent wound that seems never to go away and is not going to go away in our lifetimes for sure. Well, the original distinction you made is the critical one, the difference between God's hand and religion's marker. And religion is at the forefront of rationalizing and making enslavement seem perfectly normal, perfectly natural. It's just in the order of things. It's as natural as breathing. It's the way things ought to be. It's the way things that God has allegedly ordained society to be ordered and to run. And there is no time when slavery in a formal sense or racism in a broader sense, there's no time that religion has not been implicated and brought in order to rationalize and normalize. I think that's the key term. It's not just rationalize, but to normalize, to make it seem, well, that's just the way the way things are supposed to be. Look, I grew up in Southwest Missouri, as I said, and until I left for college, I mean, there was a very large part of my environing culture, and I'm ashamed to say myself, as part of that culture, that understood racial stratification, even racial injustice, as just the way God has ordained society to be. Now, as you mentioned Mark Knoll's name earlier, Mark has done extensive and absolutely brilliant work on the way the Bible in particular was used to normalize, again, these arrangements. The Bible also was used to confront them, usually coming from the north, but sometimes from southern voices. But men and women on both sides, or indeed all sides, because there are gradations of views. Men and women on all sides continually use the Bible to support their position. And as anybody who's read Mark Noll's work will see very quickly, there is a lot in the Bible that can be used that way.
Right.
And we Christians do have to deal with that. And that's just part of our story.
Right, right. Yeah, in that book, Mark Noll makes this case that one of the things that stands out is that whether you were a Northerner or a Southerner, whether you were pro-slavery or anti-slavery, there was a tendency in both cases to be reliant on the Bible, but to read the Bible without two ingredients he points to. One is self-consciousness, self-awareness, and the other is self-critique. And the absence of those two things means that then the reading of the text does exactly what you just said, which is that we simply think we're reading neutrally, without any self-awareness or without any self-critique. So therefore, whatever we come up with out of the instinct of our culture and the bias of our own spirit, whatever that might be, we end up seeing what we want to see. It validates things. And part of the great challenge is to try to push beyond that. And again, he makes a beautiful case for that. So
maybe I just add there quickly. I mean, he makes the argument that the Civil War was itself a theological crisis.
Yes, yes.
Because it meant that men and women on both sides are, like Abraham Lincoln put it, are appealing to the same book, and very often even the same passages in the same book. So how does this happen?
Yes, yes. Which is one of the things that has been a help to me in understanding the moment that we're living in right now. I will come to that in a few minutes. I do want to say for any listeners that I did interview Mark Noll about this book. And if you're interested in following up what Grant and I have just been talking about, you could find that in the archives of Conversing. I do want to ask next that one of the things that arises early in American history, not from the beginning, but certainly by the 18th century, is the presence of what came to be known as evangelicalism. And again, this has been one of the areas of your own scholarship, and so much of what you've written has been written in the context and in interaction, among other things, with American evangelicalism. So I'm curious if you could give us just some sense of what evangelicalism has been, what you think it is today, and if you dare to speculate, where you think it's actually headed.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, those are wonderful questions. And let me say up front that I count myself as an evangelical. And I think it's important for historians to position themselves publicly. There's no way we can get beyond our positioning. And so I see this tradition through self-interested eyes.
Yes.
So whatever I say has to be taken within that framework. I would divide your question into three parts: where evangelicalism has come from, what it is now, and where it is going. Okay. Where it has come from, well, gosh, you're going to be really surprised to hear this, but it has a deep history. And we need historians, especially we need to employ them and pay them a lot of money in order to tell this deep historical story. All right. Again, I'm facetious, but only partly facetious, because there is a tendency to look at evangelicalism as just what's happening now.
Yes.
You know, like Flip Wilson said years ago, he belonged to the church of what's happening now. Well, people look at that, say, oh, well, evangelicalism is what's happening now, and fail to see that it's a product really of centuries of development. So if I were writing a book about the deep history, I would include pietism in the continent, going back to the 18th, 17th century, and then the revivals that took place with what we now call the United Kingdom and Scotland and Britain. And those were somewhat different. The pietist and the revivalist strains are a little different, but they easily blended, all right? And what I think they gave us together, the blending, is a feature that we forget too often, and that's inwardness in our relationship with God. It's not, it's not reducible to a social movement or to a building. It's ultimately begins with our own personal covenantal, that's a reform term, but I mean it in a broader sense, our own personal covenantal relationship with Christ. And so that inwardness is what's common. All right. And then evangelicalism moves across the ocean. It moves in lots of directions, but for our purposes, it moves across the ocean and easily fits into the American context for, again, reasons that a lot of historians have looked at. But there's an elective affinity between the evangelical tradition and what it found in America.
Yes.
And for those people who are interested in and love Alexis de Tocqueville is the master here, where in the 1830s he comes to the United States and he says, this is a society that just fits. Religion and society fit hand in glove beautifully. All right. Very easily, evangelicalism becomes a mainline tradition. And I think it's fair to say that toward the end of the 19th century, the evangelical tradition is the mainline. Now, that's with a small m.
Right.
And countless variations, but it is the standard way that Protestantism operates and is understood. Lots of outliers, the Amish, and of course, say the Roman Catholic tradition. One could even say certain very ethnically rooted traditions, such as the Lutherans and their German-speaking churches, that they fall outside the evangelical mainstream. But the mainstream is just that. It is the mainstream. And a historian now not with us, Winthrop Hudson, once calculated the number of evangelical churches, and he found that Methodist churches alone, at the turn of the 20th century, Methodist churches alone almost outnumbered the number of post offices. Not quite. I mean, yeah. So we can
statistic.
Yeah. All right. Well, the evangelical tradition then becomes so identified with culture that it easily bifurcates. Well, when the challenges of science come at the end of the 20th century, the challenge of biblical higher criticism comes, that tradition then easily divides into what then was known as, liberal and then modernist and fundamentalist. The words vary, the labels vary, but basically we're talking about liberal, conservative. In the turn of the 20th century, it easily divides, and these two sides then are at war. Well, what happens then is toward the middle of the 20th century, there is yet another division. And I would say that American religion today is trifurcated, not bifurcated, but trifurcated. We have very conservatives, believers, fundamentalists, okay? On one side, liberals, modernists, establishment, whatever words we want to use, ecumenical Protestants. This is very much in vogue today. They're on the left, but this great evangelical river in the middle is still the product of this trifurcation. And this is where we find ourselves in that historical flow. Now, where we are today, it seems to me, is this. There's a great deal of talk about Christian nationalism. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'll say that I think that's basically bogus. I don't think there is Christian nationalism out there. What there is that there is nationalism that draws on Christian categories to legitimate itself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, George Bush, W., taught us not to talk about Muslim terrorism, but rather he said we're talking about terrorists who use Muslim categories. And I think exactly the same thing is happening here. And the reason we hear the term Christian nationalism, and I'll just come out and say it, it's a handy way for the media to disparage it, to put it in a box, to avoid careful analysis. It's a kind of cheap creation. It's a cheap linguistic creation of the media. Now, I'm not just bashing the media. There are plenty of historians who do the same thing, and I have on occasion when, in a hurry or something, I've done it too. Okay.
Sure.
But basically, I don't think what we're looking at is a religious movement. We're looking at a political movement that uses religious categories. And it's very unfortunate that this has happened. Okay. What kind of evidence would I go on to say that Christian nationalism is basically political, using, in the worst sense of that word, Christian categories. I think there is very solid evidence out there that religion is rarely an independent variable in determining how people vote. People usually vote because of a whole complex of features of their lives.
Yes.
Where they live, their gender, age, education, health conditions, people in my age versus students who, when I teach, I talk about mortality, right? Kids coming in at age 18 are not interested in mortality. Trust me, they're interested in other things, all right? And things that people in their 80s are not interested. You see, our social location makes a tremendous difference. And the way people vote is a product of a variety of factors that come together, and religion is one of them, but it's not independent. It is not the variable that determines vote taken by itself. So this is where I think we are. So how should we vote? How should we evaluate it all? I'm going to use a story that's told by a wonderful historian named Richard Bushman, who's a premier historian of the Latter-day Saint tradition. And Richard likes to put it this way. He says, we need to treat the people we write about fairly, because someday we're going to meet those people in heaven. And we're going to have to look them in the eye and account for ourselves. Have we written about them as fairly and honestly as we can? Or have we distorted their story in order to make ourselves look good?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's Richard's wonderful way of urging all of us to be as fair as possible. And I would go on to say that wherever there is latitude in judgment, that we should put the best face upon the past, upon the people we write about. Write about them the way we wish they would write about us. Now, there are times when you can't do it. There are times when the evidence is so overwhelming, there's just, there's no way you can put much of a good face on it.
Right.
There are people who do this. But most of the time, that's not the case. And when we can treat them with the kind of empathy that we would want, then I would hope we would do that. So to bring this back to evangelicalism, whether we are evangelicals like myself or whether we're looking at it from the outside, I would hope that historians and others and all observers would try to see the movement in its best light whenever that is possible within the boundaries of honesty.
So, Grant, where does this mean we're going, evangelicals, that is?
Where we're going is south of the equator. And it is a mark of our parochialism as a society, and of evangelicals in particular, that we are not particularly aware of the fact that Americans are not particularly aware of the fact that Christianity is growing rapidly, but not here. It's growing south of the equator. I use that again as metaphorically, but in other parts of the world. And it's growing extremely rapidly in Africa, in particular areas of parts of India, South Korea, in China, in particular parts of. Now, I'm not suggesting that evangelicalism is going to overtake the Chinese, but it is growing at a remarkable rate, even there. And there are demographers who say that by the year 2050, evangelical Christianity and evangelicalism tend to merge in south of the equator, and that by the year 2050, that will be the preponderant religious tradition on the continent of Africa. So it's growing elsewhere in the world. I once heard it was a Jesuit from, I think it was from England, and he said, you Americans are always asking God, or you're always asking the Holy Spirit to bring revival. He said, what you ought to be doing is asking the Holy Spirit to open your eyes to the revival that is already flourishing.
Right.
But just not, within your churches.
Yeah. Right.
And then ask what's going on in those churches that make it grow.
Grant, I want to go back to what you said about Christian nationalism and ask just a couple of further questions. So if I'm understanding what you're saying, there's nationalism, that's a political movement in reality. There's Christianity, which can't escape contextualized political reality, but is not fundamentally about political reality. It's about the character of God, who is greatly concerned about how social reality, interpersonal reality, institutional reality, governmental reality affects the lives of human beings. But that they're two fundamentally separate categories. So the reason why you object to Christian nationalism is that it's doing what? Is it that it's colluding, or apparently colluding in a way that isn't really honoring to the claims of the Christian faith? Or is it something else?
If I could have put that as eloquently as you did, I might have been president of Fuller Seminary. Who knows? I mean, that's conceivable, that sort of eloquence leads to that kind of career trajectory. Well, you said it precisely. I think that these are separate realms. Now, that's artificial. I mean, looking,
yes. Sure.
Obviously, an academic is the only one who's going to say that, but these are separate realms. But I love your word, that are colluding, and that's natural. That's just sure. The human condition. That happens all the time and everywhere. We never get beyond it.
Right.
The question is and it's not a bad thing in itself. The question here is, A, are we self-conscious of it? And second, and more important, can we be humble about our own finitude and our own limitations and the glasses that we wear that darken our vision?
Right.
So that we think that we are speaking for God, when in fact we may be speaking for a particular part of a particular political party. And I would add there that what I know of the sociology of what's going on is that the so-called mainline churches are at least as likely, if not more likely, to politicize the pulpit as the evangelical. Now here, my own evangelical faith and tradition maybe is a little bit defensive, but I've been in those churches now for, 80 years, and I can hardly count, I don't think I can count the number of times that I've heard an overtly political sermon from the pulpit.
Right.
That's not to say that evangelicals don't do this all the time,
yes,
but it doesn't happen in the pulpit everywhere you go. Some places, yeah, but it certainly doesn't happen everywhere you go.
Right. So one of the things that strikes me is that when you read through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures especially, you see it in the New Testament as well, but certainly in the Hebrew Scriptures, what you see is this repetitive theme of the people of God being called to be distinct, but then conforming again and again and again to the surrounding cultures. So the great danger of Christian nationalism, from my point of view, is that it simply extends that exact critique yet again, where the dominant language of the moment, which is nationalistic, is tied to, and the church is in many parts, is conforming itself to that cultural practice and baptizing it in the name of this kind of American distinctive about God and America and the Christian nation in a way that ultimately blasphemes God by suggesting that God is, in a way, almost not the Lord who reigns over all and sees and loves all people in all times and places, but the God who instead particularly and very preferentially loves America more than it loves other places and peoples. And it's in that moment where a dangerous and damaging collusion occurs, where Christianity then, in the minds of many people, is itself intrinsically nationalistic. When I would want to argue that while there's a temptation toward nationalism in the Judeo-Christian tradition, always, there is also this subversion of faith that comes about as a result of that.
Right.
Do you want to respond to that? Is that?
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I mean, all societies, at least in the West, I can't speak about outside the Western tradition, but at least in the West, all societies merge the political and the religious in one way or another. And it sometimes isn't done visibly. Sometimes it's done very explicitly, but it's always done. Societies have to fortify themselves this way. The question here, though, is there something particularly toxic going on right now in our time and place? And I would not say it's uniquely toxic, but it is distinctively toxic. It has not happened a whole lot of times.
Right.
And it certainly is here. And I think there are a couple of ingredients that make it distinctive. And the first is power. The power that certain groups have to impose their will upon others, whether that's in the economic realm or in terms of framing laws, whatever. But the powerful acquire more power. The second is prosperity. It's there, and so groups that have power frequently have the economic means to implement the power, and vice versa. And then the internet. Now, I'm not the best person to talk about this. This is a generational issue. And I go to my granddaughter to explain to me how to use my cell phone. All right, so it's very much generational, but still we can see what the internet does is it connects us more broadly. And I was recently reading a piece in the Wall Street Journal that was very interesting, in which it said what it does that's so distinctive we don't think about is bring in the factor of speed.
Yes.
It connects us instantly.
Right.
And for some reason, speed is a narcotic for humans, right?
Yes.
And we love speed, and we want to be connected. We want to be connected now.
Yes.
And so many other people know all the ramifications of this so much better than I. But we're looking at power, economic capacity, and what the digital revolution has done for us. And bring those things together.
Yes.
I think we have something that is particularly dangerous on our hands. Yes.
So we can hardly talk about evangelicalism, Graham, without thinking of one of the leading figures in American evangelical history, whom you are an expert on, namely Billy Graham. So I'd like you to just take a few moments to give us a sense of what you think Billy's stature was and what you think Billy's stature now is and will perhaps enduringly be. How do you see his past and present reputation and legacy?
The past reputation from the middle of the 1950s to the end of the 20th century is that he was, in my judgment, not simply the most prominent evangelical, but rather he occupied a space that was unique. He and others measured themselves in terms of their proximity to him. And he was, in effect, a kind of umbrella figure. He was a carapace that stood outside of and over the rest. He did not seek that, but this is, for a variety of reasons, this is what happened. And I think it's no accident that after he has left us, that evangelicalism has fragmented in ways that are just very, very sad to see the degree of fragmentation and even the vociferousness, the divisiveness that has come about. Billy kept it all together. And that is the stature that he once had. Right. One could argue, I'll be very, very brief, one could argue, I have argued, that Billy Graham, Martin Luther King, and John Paul II dominated the second half of the 20th century religiously in different ways. But that's where he was.
Yes. I was just recently at a memorial service for a very, very honored African-American Black leader in Oakland, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr., who was the pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church for over 40 years. Absolutely astounding person. And in his memorial services, there were frequent references to MLK and the power of his legacy. And that's one major track. And as I was listening to that, I was aware that, understandably in that context, that it was MLK that they were pointing to. But there, in this tradition that I'm talking about, that was a J. Alfred Smith tradition, very much, as I said it in my brief remarks in one of the services, that he was a man who named reality. He named the reality of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ very clearly and powerfully. And he named the reality of the world, which was a world of injustice and suffering, especially for Black people. And as I was thinking about the service and the comments that were made about J. Alfred, I was thinking about Billy Graham because of the way that he, just like J. Alfred, who came into that legacy and clarity, so Billy Graham came into greater clarity himself over the arc of his life in naming the reality of the gospel and the reality of a world of suffering, pain, sin, and injustice. I wonder if you just want to comment on that.
Well, yeah, I think that two broad trends can be seen. One is that over the course of his life, he became increasingly moderate, theologically, increasingly inclusive in the application of his theology. In general, there were exceptions. It was not a linear trajectory. Like most people, for the most part, he went in one direction, but with some lateral movements and a couple times some backward movements. But on the whole, I think that we can see that certainly in his understanding of race, where in general, he posted a progressive position. Wonderful historian named Bill Martin has said that Billy was never in front of the platoon, but he was never very far behind the leader. Mm-hmm. That's an approximation to Bill's comment. And I think that's exactly right. In 1982, I think it was, Graham was in the Patriarchal Cathedral in Moscow. And he said he'd gone through 3 conversions in his life. The first conversion was to Jesus Christ. The second conversion was his awareness of racial injustice in America. And the third conversion was to his awareness that the United States and the Soviet Union, as it was called then, were on the precipice of obliterating civilization. And this brought him to one of the most progressive, among all Christians, he did become a leader in the move toward nuclear disarmament. And very briefly, he said the United States and the Soviet Union are like 2 little boys in a bathtub filled with gasoline playing with matches. And so he did post, I think, a pretty unbroken record and his awareness of the dangers in that sphere. It was not, in all spheres by any means. Well, most of us are more progressive in some things than in others.
Right.
And that's where he was, yeah.
For our listeners' sake, I want to underscore that Grant is really one of the leading scholars on Billy Graham and has 2 volumes that are in the notes that we'll refer you to that will help you to find further reflection and thought that Grant has devoted to the subject of Billy Graham. Really, really valuable works. Grant, let's conclude with one final question. I know this is extending our conversation longer than usual, but I don't want to let go without asking this. Here you are, the noble 80 that you are. You've taught for 50 years.
You're not going to let that go, are you? Okay.
It's just such a round number. Well, actually, of course, 80 and a half. But
now that you've passed 40, okay.
Yes. So having taught for years at college, seminary, and at the doctoral level, what have those years of teaching taught you, and what haven't they taught you? I just would love to have you reflect on that.
They've taught me a lot of things about students, and I hope they've taught me some things about myself. On the whole, I've become more aware of the diversity of students' life experiences. And I thought many times of trying to write a book of all the funny things that have happened. They are very funny, but their experiences are so different, and they come from such different life situations. But I would say that on the whole, I look back at this, I'm impressed by the earnestness of my students. And they don't get that much credit for it. We talk about how well they do on a trigonometry exam or whatever, or what happens on weekends. And that's not always something you want to brag about. But on the whole, they are earnest and they are serious about doing well for themselves, but also, and more important, doing well for the world that they live in. What that teaching has taught me is that if I've had any skill in doing it, that this is a gift, and it is not earned.
Right.
And it comes as a gift, and I am increasingly aware of the giftedness of
Yes.
whatever has good things have come.
Yeah, yeah. What two beautiful things, gosh. Earnestness and a gift. That's not a man marked by cynicism. It's a person marked by graciousness and humility. And among those two qualities and your hilarious sense of humor, you are a very special person to me and to so many people.
Thank you.
And your scholarship,
It is mutual.
Grant, has really been such an important contribution. And I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I've relished every moment of it. So
Well, thank you.
God bless you. And thank you again.
I was honored. Yeah, indeed.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.